The cold was a physical thing in the town that had no name. It was not merely an absence of heat, but a presence, an entity that sank its teeth into the frozen mud of the main street and breathed a ghost-white vapor against the grimy panes of the general store. It was a cold that promised permanence, that whispered of a long and unforgiving winter, and it had already leached the color from the world, leaving behind only shades of gray and the bruised purple of the low-slung sky. The wind, its accomplice, scoured the clapboard buildings with a sound like a dull knife being drawn across bone. Huddled in the shallow alcove of the assayer's office, a woman and a small child were becoming part of that gray landscape. They were a study in displacement, their clothes thin and dark, better suited to a city street in a milder season than this brutal prelude to a mountain winter. The woman's shawl was a flimsy argument against the wind's relentless logic, and the boy, no more than 5, was a small, tight knot of shivering misery pressed against her side. His face was pale, his lips a faint blue, and he had long ago stopped complaining, sinking into a silent endurance that was more heartbreaking than any cry. They were invisible to the town. People passed, heads down, shoulders hunched, their own battles with the cold too pressing to allow for the acknowledgement of another's. They were a problem without a simple solution, and so they were not seen. The man saw them. He saw them from the moment he guided his wagon to a halt in front of the mercantile. He did not stare, but his gaze, as he looped the reins around the hitching post, was a quiet, searching thing. He was a solid, deliberate shape against the bleakness. His coat a heavy canvas, worn and stained with the honest dirt of hard labor. His face was weathered, carved by sun and wind into a mask of stoicism, but his eyes were clear and missed nothing. He had a stillness about him, the kind that came from long hours spent in the company of only the land and the sky. He had come to town for salt, flour, and coffee, a trip he made only when necessity outweighed his preference for solitude. He had planned to be on his way back to his ranch before the last of the week daylight failed. He went about his business with an economy of movement, his transactions with the storekeeper brief and conducted in a low voice. He loaded his supplies into the wagon bed, his motions unhurried yet efficient. All the while, he was aware of the two figures in the alcove, a silent, static tragedy playing out in the corner of his vision. He knew their story without knowing it. He had seen it before. They were from somewhere else, had arrived on a hopeful tide that had receded, leaving them stranded and destitute. The town, wary of outsiders and burdened by its own struggles, had offered no purchase. They had been sent back from the boarding house twice. The proprietor, a woman with a heart as hard as the frozen ground, who declared them a liability. They were on their way to becoming ghosts. The silence in his own cabin was a loud thing. It had been for 3 years. It was a silence composed of memories and absences, a ringing void where laughter and soft words used to be. He had grown accustomed to it, had learned to live inside its echo. But today, the sight of the woman and child made that silence feel different. It felt less like a monument to his grief and more like a barren, wasted space. He finished loading the last sack of flour, the canvas rough against his calloused hands. The sun was a weak, watery disk, already sinking behind the jagged peaks to the west. The wind sharpened, carrying the first stinging bite of sleet. The storm was coming. He did not walk toward them with purpose. He simply finished his task and found himself standing a few feet away, his shadow falling over them. The woman looked up, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and exhaustion. They were dark eyes, and in their depths, he saw a pride that had been battered but not broken. She pulled the child closer, a purely instinctual gesture of protection. "The storm will be bad," he said. His voice was rough from disuse, like stones grinding together. It was not a question or an offer, merely a statement of fact. The woman said nothing, only watched him, her body tense. He was another man in a world of men who had offered nothing but trouble or indifference. He looked away from her, his gaze fixed on the darkening horizon. "I have a ranch, north of here. I need a cook, someone to mend. The work is hard. The pay is a roof and food. It's all I have." The offer was laid out like a set of tools on a workbench, plain, functional, without adornment. There was no pity in his voice, only a stark pragmatism that was, in its own way, a form of respect. He was not offering charity. He was proposing a transaction, a solution to two different kinds of emptiness. The woman's throat worked, but no sound came out. She looked down at her son, whose shivering had intensified. The boy's small hand was tucked inside her own, a fragile warmth against her cold skin. Survival was no longer a matter of pride. It was a simple, brutal equation, the alcove and the storm on one side, this stranger and his offer on the other. There were no other terms. "We will not be a burden," she finally managed to say, her voice a thin, reedy whisper against the rising wind. It was a statement, not a plea, a declaration of the last piece of dignity she possessed. The man gave a short, sharp nod. "The wagon is there." He turned and walked back to it without looking to see if they followed. He knew they would. There was nowhere else for them to go. He untied the reins, his movements as deliberate as before. A moment later, he heard the soft crunch of their worn shoes on the frozen ground behind him. He helped the boy up onto the seat, his large, rough hands surprisingly gentle, then gave the woman a hand. He did not speak again as he climbed up beside them, taking the reins and urging the horses forward, away from the town and into the vast, gathering twilight. The journey to his homestead was a silent, punishing ordeal. The sleet turned to snow, thick and wet, driven by a wind that moaned through the sparse pines lining the trail. The man pulled a heavy wool blanket from behind the seat and, without a word, draped it over the woman and the child. It was an act of impersonal care, like checking the lashings on his cargo. The woman pulled it tight, a shield against the biting cold, and felt the boy's trembling slowly subside as the shared warmth took hold. She watched the man, his profile a rigid silhouette against the swirling white. He seemed impervious to the cold, a part of the harsh landscape itself, his focus entirely on the path ahead, which was now barely visible. The world had shrunk to the small, swaying circle of the wagon, the rhythmic plodding of the horses, and the howl of the storm. He thought about the space they would occupy. The loft above the main room was dry and clean, used for storing extra tack and dried goods. It would be enough. He considered the logistics with a detached clarity that kept other softer thoughts at bay. He needed help. The endless cycle of ranch work, cooking, and mending left him with little time for the larger repairs the coming winter demanded. His hands were torn and raw from splitting wood and fixing fences in the freezing air. Acquiring help was a practical necessity. That was all it was. He refused to let his mind wander to the small carved cradle stored in that same loft, buried under a canvas tarp, a relic from the life that had been scoured from this place. After what felt like an eternity, the wagon turned off the main track and onto a smaller, rougher path. The trees grew thicker, offering a slight reprieve from the wind. Soon, a shape emerged from the gloom, a long, low cabin with a sturdy stone chimney from which no smoke rose. A barn stood nearby, a dark, hulking shape, and a series of corrals stretched out beyond it. The place was neat, brutally simple, and organized with a meticulous hand. It was the home of a man who did not live in it so much as occupy it. There was no softness, no sign of comfort for comfort's sake. It was a fortress against the wilderness and against memory. He led the horses into the barn, the sudden stillness and scent of hay and animals a welcome shock after the chaos of the storm. He unhitched the team with swift, practiced movements, then lit a lantern. The golden light cast long, dancing shadows. He gestured for the woman and child to wait in the tack room, where it was slightly warmer. When he returned, he led them not to the main cabin door, but to a smaller one at the side. It opened into a mudroom, where he instructed them to leave their wet, thin coats and worn-out shoes. He gave them each a pair of thick wool socks from a crate by the door. The main room of the cabin was dominated by a large stone fireplace, cold and dark. Furniture was sparse and handmade. A sturdy table, two chairs, a single armchair by the hearth. Everything was clean, scrubbed bare, but the air was thick with a profound emptiness. It was a place of function, not of living. He moved to the fireplace and within minutes had a fire crackling, its warmth slowly beginning to push back the deep, settled chill of the room. The firelight flickered across his face, revealing lines of exhaustion she had not seen before. While the fire grew, he moved to the stove, stoking its embers and adding fresh wood. He put a pot of coffee on to brew and pulled a heavy cast-iron skillet from a hook. He worked without speaking, his movements economical and precise. He sliced thick slabs of bacon and cracked eggs into the sizzling fat. The smell filled the cabin, rich and life-affirming, a stark contrast to the sterile silence. He set two plates on the table. Along with a loaf of dark bread and a crock of butter, he gestured to the table. Eat! The boy, who had been huddled near the growing warmth of the fire, looked at his mother for permission. She gave a slight nod, and he scrambled onto a chair. The woman sat more slowly, her movements stiff with cold and weariness. They ate with a desperate, ravenous hunger that spoke of days of deprivation. They did not speak, focusing only on the food. The man poured himself a cup of coffee and sat in the armchair by the fire, watching them. He did not eat. His observation was not unkind, but it was distant, a detached curiosity. He was assessing them, his new acquisitions, gauging their state. He saw the way the woman made sure her son ate his fill before she finished her own plate, the way she broke her bread into small, neat pieces. He saw resilience there, a carefully preserved sense of order in the midst of chaos. When they were finished, she gathered the plates, her intention clear. He stopped her with a single gesture. Leave them. There is a ladder to the loft. You'll find blankets in the chest. He pointed toward a dark corner of the room where a simple wooden ladder was fixed to the wall. He had already laid out two clean, rough-spun blankets and a pair of thin mattresses on the floorboards. The message was clear. This was their space, separate and apart. He had offered a roof, not a home. The kindness he had shown felt as sharp and dangerous as the winter itself, a thing to be handled with caution. She was a necessity he had acquired, a tool to make his life more manageable. She nodded, her face unreadable in the flickering light. Thank you, she said, the words quiet but firm. She took Son's hand and led him to the ladder. The boy, his belly full and his body warm for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, was already half asleep. The man watched them ascend into the shadows of the loft, then turned his attention back to the fire. The silence that returned to the cabin was different now. It was no longer empty. It was occupied, inhabited by the soft sounds of breathing from above. It was, he thought, a complication he had not fully considered. He listened to the storm raging outside, a wild and lonely sound, and felt the first unwelcome crack in the wall of solitude he had so carefully built around himself. For 3 days, the storm locked them inside the cabin. The world outside was a maelstrom of wind and snow, a howling white wilderness that erased the landscape and reinforced their isolation. It was a period of quiet adjustment. The man fell into his established rhythms, mending tack in the armchair by the fire, sharpening tools at his workbench in the corner, his hands always busy. He was a man made restless by stillness, driven by a need to impose order on a world that had once descended into chaos. The woman and the boy learned his silent language. They learned the creak of the floorboard that signaled he was rising before dawn, the sharp scrape of his razor in the morning, the heavy thud of his boots as he went out to the barn to tend to the animals, a journey he made through the blizzard twice a day. The woman, for her part, began to claim her role. She did not wait to be asked. She found the broom and swept the floors. She washed the dishes he had told her to leave. She discovered his meager stores and began to impose her own order, organizing sacks of flour and beans, taking quiet inventory. She found a sewing kit with needles and thread and began mending the stack of worn shirts and canvas trousers she found in a basket. Her hands, like his, were always moving, a quiet testament to a life that had never known idleness. The boy, shy and watchful, stayed close to the fire, sketching pictures on a small slate he found, his world reduced to the warm, firelit cabin and the two quiet adults who moved around him like planets in a silent orbit. On the fourth morning, they awoke to a world transformed. The wind had died and a profound, muffled silence had fallen. The man opened the cabin door to a landscape buried under a thick, pristine blanket of snow. The sun, brilliant in a cloudless, cobalt blue sky, struck dazzling sparks from the crystalline surface. It was beautiful. But it was also a challenge. The corrals needed to be dug out, paths cleared to the well and the woodpile, and the heavy weight of snow cleared from the barn roof before it could cause damage. It was a mountain of work. He dressed in his heavy winter gear, preparing to face the day's labor alone, as he always did. But as he pulled on his boots, the woman was standing there, her own thin coat on, her expression resolute. Her son stood beside her, bundled as best he could be. "We will help," she said. It was not a question. He looked at her. at her inadequate coat and worn shoes. He looked at the boy. The work is too heavy. The cold is dangerous. Stay inside. It was a command born of practicality, not concern. We will not be sheltered pets, she replied, her voice low but unyielding. We earn our keep. Give us a task. Her insistence was a statement, a refusal to be a passive recipient of his reluctant charity. She was staking a claim, not just to a space in his cabin, but to a role in this life. She would not be fragile. She would not be a burden. He studied her for a long moment, a flicker of something, annoyance perhaps, or a grudging respect, in his eyes. He saw the steel in her spine, the same pride he had seen in the alcove in town. He gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. He went to a large trunk in the corner and pulled out an old oilskin coat, much too large for her, and a pair of worn but sturdy gloves. He found a smaller shovel for the boy. He did not offer them with any warmth. He simply laid them on the table. The path to the woodpile first. He watched them work from the corner of his eye as he began the grueling task of clearing the corral. He expected her to tire quickly, to retreat to the warmth of the cabin, but she did not. She worked with a steady, determined rhythm, her movements efficient, wasting no energy. She showed the boy how to clear the lighter snow, turning the work into a game. Despite her obvious fragility, she possessed a core of surprising strength. She did not complain. She did not falter. She simply worked, her breath pluming in the frigid air, her face set with concentration. By midday, they had cleared the essential paths. He saw her pause, rubbing her arms against a chill that had clearly settled deep into her bones. He said nothing, but when he went inside to heat up the leftover stew from the night before, he left the door ajar. A few minutes later, she and the boy came inside, their faces flushed with cold and effort. That afternoon, while he was up on the barn roof, carefully pushing off the heavy drifts of snow, he sent her to the loft to fetch a coil of rope he needed. As she searched for it, her hand brushed against its canvas tarp. Curiosity, a feeling she had not had the luxury to indulge in for a long time, got the better of her. She lifted a corner. Underneath was a small wooden cradle, beautifully made, its runners smooth and worn. Beside it was a small, locked chest. On top of the chest sat a single carved wooden bird, its painted feathers faded, its tiny form held with a care that spoke of a deep and painful love. She felt a sudden, sharp pang of understanding. This was not just an empty house, it was a hollowed-out one. She quickly dropped the canvas back into place, a feeling of trespass making her cheeks burn. The silence of this place was not empty. It was full of ghosts. When she brought him the rope, her eyes held a new, softer knowledge, a compassion that he did not see, or chose to ignore. She worked with even greater determination after that, as if trying to fill the hollow spaces with the simple, honest currency of her labor. Weeks turned into a month. A fragile routine settled over the ranch, as delicate as the first layer of ice on a puddle. The woman and her son were no longer just occupants. They were part of the machinery of the place. She cooked and cleaned and mended, her quiet competence transforming the sterile cabin into something that resembled a home. The boy, losing his initial fear, began to explore, his laughter occasionally a startling, bright sound in the quiet air. The rancher watched it all from his self-imposed distance, the changes happening around him whether he willed them or not. He found his mended shirts folded neatly, a hot meal waiting for him, no matter how late he came in from the cold, the fire always banked and ready. He did not acknowledge these comforts, but their presence was undeniable, a slow thaw seeping into the permafrost of his existence. The arrival of the buggy was an intrusion, a violation of the ranch's isolation. It was a fine, polished vehicle, drawn by a handsome black mare, and it looked profoundly out of place against the rough-hewn backdrop of the barn and corrals. The woman who sat in it was equally out of place. She was the wife of the wealthiest landowner in the valley, a woman whose power was derived from her husband's money and her own sharp-edged piety. She dressed in dark, expensive wool, a stark contrast to the homespun reality of the ranch, and her face was set in an expression of perpetual disapproval. The rancher saw her coming from a long way off and met her in the yard, his posture a silent wall of deterrence. He did not invite her down from the buggy. "Good morning," she said, her voice crisp and cold. It was not a greeting but an opening salvo. "I was in town and heard the most peculiar story. I felt it was my Christian duty to investigate. The rancher simply waited, his expression unchanging. His silence was a weapon she was not accustomed to facing. Her smile was thin and unpleasant. They say you've taken in strays. She let the word hang in the air, freighted with contempt. Her gaze flickered toward the cabin. Where the woman had appeared in the doorway, the boy half hidden behind her skirts. A foreign woman, I hear, of questionable background. And her child. The rancher's eyes did not leave the antagonist's face. I hired a housekeeper. A housekeeper, she repeated, savoring the word with theatrical disbelief. A man like you, alone all these years, suddenly finds he needs a housekeeper. A young one, at that. People are talking. They are concerned. It is not a respectable arrangement. It sets a poor example. Her goal was clear: to use the threat of social ruin, to impose her will, to shame him into casting the woman and child out. She was the self-appointed guardian of the valley's morals, a role that allowed her to wield prejudice as a cudgel. From the doorway, the woman felt a cold dread snake around her heart. She had seen this woman in town, had felt the sting of her dismissive, judgmental glare. She represented the world that had cast her out, the polite, cruel society that saw her not as a person, but as a problem to be excised. She pulled her son closer, her hand trembling slightly. The rancher took a single, deliberate step forward, placing himself more squarely between the buggy and his cabin. It was a small movement, but its meaning was absolute. He was a physical barrier, a declaration. What people say is not my concern, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion, yet carrying an unmistakable weight of finality. And what happens on my land is not yours. He then did something that shocked both women. He reached out and gently took hold of the mare's bridle, his touch firm and commanding. He turned the horse and the buggy in a slow, inexorable circle, pointing them back down the track they had come. It was a dismissal more profound than any angry shout. They are under my protection, he said. The words spoken so quietly they were almost lost in the vastness of the landscape. But they were clear. They were a vow. The social tyrant's face flushed with an ugly mottled red. To be dismissed so thoroughly, so quietly, was an insult she could not abide. Her mask of piety slipped, revealing the raw fury beneath. You will regret this, she hissed, snatching the reins and striking her mare with a sharp flick of the whip. This valley will not stand for such filth in its midst. You have made an enemy today. The buggy sped away, leaving a cloud of disturbed snow and a ringing silence in its wake. The fragile peace of the ranch had been shattered. The outside world, with its judgments and its cruelty, had found them. The woman remained frozen in the doorway. The force of the woman's hatred, a palpable thing, a poison that now tainted the air of their sanctuary. The rancher stood for a long moment, watching the buggy disappear, his back a rigid line of defiance. The warning shot had been fired. The fight for this fragile, emerging family had just begun. The silence that fell in the cabin afterward was heavy with unspoken things, thick with the new and dangerous knowledge that they were no longer just isolated. They were besieged. That evening, the quiet in the cabin was different. It was no longer a comfortable rhythm of shared work, but a tense, watchful stillness. The confrontation in the yard had drawn a line, creating a clear us and them, but it had also raised a question that now hung, unspoken, in the air between them. The man sat by the fire, cleaning a rifle, his movements methodical, his face a stony mask. The woman sat at the table, mending one of her son's shirts, her stitches small and perfect, a desperate attempt to impose order on a world that felt increasingly chaotic. The boy was asleep in the loft, safe for now from the adult fears that crowded the room below. Finally, the woman put down her sewing. The silence had become too loud to bear. She looked at the man's broad back, at the way the firelight played over the worn fabric of his shirt. Why? She asked, her voice barely a whisper. Why did you help us? He did not stop his work. The rhythmic scrape of the cleaning rod in the rifle barrel was the only sound for a long time. She thought he would not answer, that he would retreat back into the fortress of his silence. But then the scraping stopped. He set the rifle down carefully and turned in his chair to face her. The firelight carved deep shadows into his face, making him look older, more weary than she had ever seen him. This place, he began, his voice low and rough, had too much nothing in it. A silence that was getting louder than a scream. He paused, searching for words he had not used in years. My wife, my daughter, they died. Fever, 3 winters ago. Took them both in a week. He said it plainly, without inflection, a simple statement of a world-ending fact. I built this cabin for them, every log, every stone. After they were gone, it wasn't a home anymore. It was just a box filled with ghosts. He looked at her then, his gaze direct and unshielded for the first time. I saw you in town, you and the boy. You had nothing left. I had too much nothing. It seemed like a way to make a different kind of quiet, a better kind. He wasn't offering comfort or seeking sympathy. He was explaining a piece of grim, personal arithmetic, the logic of a man trying to balance an unbearable equation. His grief was a vast, empty landscape, and they were the first signs of life he had allowed into it. The confession laid his own brokenness bare, and in doing so, it gave her the courage to reveal hers. She reached into a small cloth pouch she always wore around her neck and drew out a small, flat object. She placed it on the table between them. It was a butterfly, carved from a shard of pale green jade, but one of its wings was broken clean off. The firelight caught in the polished stone, making it glow with a soft internal light. We did not just leave our home, she said, her eyes fixed on the broken treasure. We fled. My husband was a scholar, a man who believed in books and the truth. He wrote things that angered powerful men. Her voice was steady, but her hands were clasped so tightly in her lap that her knuckles were white. They came for him in the night. He gave me this. She touched the jade butterfly and told me to run, to take our son and never look back. He said he would follow. She looked up and he saw the deep, unending ocean of her own loss reflected in her eyes. He never did. The man he angered, he is not the kind of man who forgives a debt. He is a transactional man. He believes my husband stole something from him. A business opportunity, a contract my husband's writings exposed as fraudulent. He believes that we, my son and I, are part of that debt, that we belong to him until it is repaid. She took a shuddering breath. He sent men to look for us. That is why we kept moving. Why we ended up here, at the end of the world, with nothing. The two stories settled in the quiet room, two halves of the same brutal truth. They were both survivors of a world that took without reason. They were both haunted. The woman in the buggy, with her petty cruelties and social judgments, was a small threat compared to the relentless, cold predator who stalked the woman's past. The man looked from her face to the broken jade on the table. He understood now. The stakes were far higher than he had imagined. The social tyrant from the valley was a nuisance, a circling vulture. But the man she spoke of was a wolf, and he was hunting. The rancher's pragmatic decision to hire a housekeeper had unwittingly placed him in the center of a much older, more dangerous conflict. He felt a slow, cold anger begin to burn in his gut. It was an old, familiar feeling, an emotion he thought had died with his family. It was the feeling of a protector. He stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the silent, snow-covered darkness. "He will not find you here," he said. It was not a promise of hope, but a statement of intent. The dynamic between them had irrevocably shifted. He was no longer just a man offering a roof. He was a man who now understood he must provide a fortress. And she was no longer a stray he had taken in, but a fellow survivor, a partner in a war he had just silently declared. The transactional villain arrived on the first day of the thaw. The world was dripping, the snow receding in dirty patches to reveal the muddy ground beneath. He did not come in a humble buggy, but in a hired coach from the nearest city, a vehicle that bespoke wealth and importance. He was a man who looked as though the mud would not dare to touch his polished boots. He was dressed in a fine city suit, his face smooth and smug, his eyes holding the cold, appraising look of a man who views people as assets on a ledger. He was accompanied by two large, silent men who stood behind him like grim bookends. The rancher met them in the yard, just as he had met the woman. But this time, the air was not just tense, it was lethal. The woman and her son watched from the cabin window, her face a mask of stark terror. This was the ghost from her past made flesh, the source of all her fear. "I believe you have something that belongs to me," the villain said without preamble, his voice smooth and cultured, a sound that was utterly alien in this rough-hewn place. He produced a sheaf of papers from his coat pocket, an indenture contract, signed by her late husband. In repayment of a significant debt, his family's labor was pledged to my company. The contract is legal, binding, and recognized in every territory. He held it out, a smug, triumphant smile playing on his lips. She and the boy are my property until the debt is satisfied. I am here to collect them. The rancher did not look at the papers. His eyes were fixed on the man's face. This is my land. They are not leaving. The villain's smile widened. I anticipated some provincial resistance. He gestured to the papers. This is a legal claim. If you resist, I will return with the territorial marshal. You will be charged with theft of property and obstruction. I am a reasonable man. I will give you 3 days to see reason. At noon, on the third day, I will return with the law. I advise you to have them packed and ready. He turned, his movements crisp and confident, and climbed back into his coach, leaving his ultimatum hanging in the air like the stench of poison. The next 2 days were a blur of desperate, quiet activity. The ranch became a war room. The woman, her initial terror hardening into a steely resolve, revealed a skill the rancher had never suspected. Her husband had taught her to read and write, not just simple prose, but legal documents and account books. She was intelligent and methodical. They spread the villain's contract out on the table, and she pored over it, her finger tracing the dense, legalistic script. He is a cheat, she whispered, her voice tight with concentration. My husband told me. His contracts are always built on a lie, but the lie is buried deep. While she searched for a flaw in the paper fortress, the rancher made a move of his own. He rode into town under the cover of darkness. The telegraph office was closed, but he knew the operator, a young man whose father he had once helped during a bad winter. He woke him up. On a small yellow slip of paper, he wrote out a message. It was not long, but it was coded, a series of phrases and numbers that would mean nothing to anyone else. It was addressed to a name and a city far to the east, a contact from a life he had left behind long ago, a life that had involved more than just ranching. He had been a different kind of man once, a man who understood how to navigate the shadowed corridors of power and finance. He paid the operator handsomely for his time and his silence. This is a long shot, he told the young man, but it's the only one I have. The clicking of the telegraph keys sending his message out into the vast, dark network of the world was a small sound of hope against a tidal wave of despair. They worked through the nights, fueled by black coffee and a grim determination. The woman found a discrepancy, a small one, in the dates and interest calculations on the contract, but she knew it wouldn't be enough to invalidate the entire document. The rancher fortified the homestead, not as if expecting a gunfight, but as if preparing for a siege, checking every lock, every window, creating a physical bastion to match their legal one. The hope from the telegraph was a fragile, flickering candle in a hurricane. They both knew the reply might not come in time, or at all. Noon on the third day arrived with a cold, clear finality. The sun was high in the sky. The villain returned as promised, and this time, he was not alone. He rode beside the territorial marshal, a weary-looking man with a tin star on his chest, and trailing behind them, her face a mask of vindicated triumph, was the social tyrant from the valley. She had come to witness the downfall she had predicted, to see the filth scoured from her pristine world. They halted in the yard. The marshal dismounted, his expression grim. I have a warrant here, he said, holding up a document. Based on this indenture contract, I'm here to enforce it. I don't want any trouble. The rancher stood on the porch of his cabin, the woman and child behind him. He was not armed, but his stance was one of absolute defiance. The contract is fraudulent, he said, his voice calm and steady. The villain laughed, a short, ugly sound. A desperate claim from an ignorant farmer. Marshal, do your duty. The marshal took a reluctant step forward. He was a man of the law, and the paper in his hand was the law, as far as he was concerned. It was at that exact moment that the sound of a furiously galloping horse echoed down the trail. A young boy from the town, whipping his mount into a lather, burst into the clearing. He was waving a yellow piece of paper. The telegraph operator's son. For you, he yelled, sliding off his horse and thrusting the telegraph into the rancher's hand. The rancher took it, his face unreadable. He unfolded it and read the brief message. A slow, almost imperceptible change came over his features. The tension in his shoulders seemed to dissolve. He looked up, his eyes locking with the villain's. He then handed the telegraph not to the villain, but to the marshal. I believe you'll find this of interest. The marshal took it, his brow furrowed in confusion. He read the message. His eyes widened. He read it again, his mouth falling slightly open. He looked from the paper to the smug, confident face of the transactional villain, and his expression hardened into one of cold, professional fury. "Well, it looks like you've had this handled all along," the marshal said, his voice dripping with a newfound respect as he looked at the rancher. He turned to the villain. "This telegraph is from the United States Attorney's Office in the Eastern District. It identifies you as a man wanted on federal warrants for fraud, racketeering, and conspiracy. It says your contracts, your company, all of it, are part of a criminal enterprise. It also says there's a substantial reward for your capture." The color drained from the villain's face. His smug confidence evaporated, replaced by the panicked look of a cornered rat. His two henchmen took a step back, disassociating themselves from their employer. The social tyrant's jaw dropped, her moment of triumph turning to ashes in her mouth. "This is a lie. A trick," the villain stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. "You can explain that to a federal judge," the marshal said, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. He nodded to the rancher. "My apologies for the intrusion." He arrested the sputtering villain, his movements swift and efficient. The social tyrant, humiliated and exposed as an ally to a wanted criminal, turned her buggy around and fled without a word, her public shaming complete. As the marshal led his now valuable prisoner away, he paused and tipped his hat to the rancher. It was a small gesture, but it was a profound acknowledgement of respect, a recognition of a quiet, honorable strength that had just triumphed over a loud, corrupt power. The threat was gone. The silence that descended on the yard was one of pure, triumphant relief. The spring that followed was a season of profound rebirth, both for the land and for the three people who lived on it. The snow melted away for good, and the valley floor erupted in a riot of green grass and wildflowers. The air grew soft and warm, carrying the scent of damp earth and new life. The harsh, monochrome world of winter was replaced by a vibrant palette of color and sound. The change was mirrored in the small homestead, which was undergoing its own quiet transformation. The rancher was no longer defined by his grief. The work of the ranch continued, relentless as ever, but now it was shared. He found himself in conversation, discussing plans for planting a garden with the woman or explaining the workings of a harness to the boy, who shadowed his every move with wide-eyed adoration. The silence in the cabin was no longer a hollow echo of loss, but a comfortable, living quiet, punctuated by the boy's questions, the woman's soft humming as she worked, and even, on rare occasions, the low rumble of the rancher's own laughter. He began to build, adding a new room onto the side of the cabin, the sound of his hammer, a rhythmic, hopeful beat against the backdrop of the valley. He was not just expanding a structure, he was building a home, making space for a future he had never thought he would have. The woman, too, was transformed. With the shadow of her past lifted, she
Awesome.
blossomed. The fear that had lived in her eyes for so long was replaced by a calm confidence. She was no longer a refugee but a partner, her intelligence and resilience now assets in building their shared life. Her garden thrived under her care, providing them with fresh vegetables. She managed the household accounts with a sharp mind, finding ways to save and prosper. Her reputation in the valley, once poisoned by gossip, was slowly restored. When the rancher went to town for supplies, she and the boy now went with him, their heads held high. The townspeople, having witnessed the public humiliation of the social tyrant and heard the story of the villain's capture, now greeted them with a newfound respect. They were no longer outsiders but a family, forged in hardship and proven by their integrity. The found family was now whole. The foreman and the few hands the rancher hired for the spring roundup saw the change. They had initially been wary of the woman and child, but they had quickly come to respect her hard work and the quiet authority she held. They saw the way the rancher looked at her when he thought no one was watching, a look of profound tenderness and gratitude. They saw the way the boy looked at him with the unconditional love of a son. They understood that they were not just working on a ranch. They were witnessing the careful, deliberate construction of a family. One evening, as the sun sank behind the mountains, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple, the three of them sat on the porch of the newly expanded cabin. The rancher had built a swing, and he and the woman sat on it, moving in a slow, gentle rhythm, while the boy lay on the steps, tracing patterns in the dust. The air was cool and sweet. The sounds were of the evening, the chirp of crickets, the lowing of cattle in the distance, the soft creak of the porch swing. The woman leaned her head against his shoulder, a simple, comfortable gesture that spoke volumes. The broken jade butterfly, its wing now carefully mended with a fine silver wire by the rancher's steady hands, lay against her collarbone. "It's peaceful," she said softly. He looked out over the land, his land, which had once been a refuge for his sorrow, and was now the foundation of his joy. He put his arm around her, drawing her closer. "A home is not the land you own," he said, his voice quiet but sure, filled with a warmth she had never heard before. "It is the people you choose to protect on it." The silence that followed was not empty, it was full. It was the sound of a family, finally and completely at peace. It was the sound of home.